Hi there everyone! Welcome to the first in a series of short scripting tutorials for Arma Reforger. I'm going to attempt to approach this from the angle of a beginner, and by this I mean that those who are new to scripting in Arma Reforger, or just in general, should be able to take what I've done here and run with it to create their own scripts. For those who watched my previous video, there will be parts that are rehashed here, but this will be a more focused and in-depth look without all the fluff, essentially. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at spawning AI via script in Arma Reforger, and by the end of this tutorial, you should be able to spawn your own AI group and assign them a waypoint via script. So to start, let's open up Arma Reforger Tools, also known as Workbench. What we're going to do is create ourselves a new project. You can name it what you like, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to call it rs_scripting tutorial. You will not need to supply any dependencies, so just the default Arma Reforger is okay. Okay, once your workbench is loaded, what we're going to go do first is create ourselves a new world. This will help us test our script once we have it running. So what you're going to do is go to the resource browser on the left-hand side. Open up the Arma Reforger folder, followed by the Worlds folder, followed by the Eden folder, and inside of that folder, so you can click on it to access that, you're going to open the eden.ent file. Once it has loaded, we're going to click the Create New World button on the top left-hand side of the screen, so it's this guy over here. And once we've opened this up, we're going to select the bottom checklist that says Subscene of Current World. This will enable us to edit over the top of the default Eden world that is created here. Once you've created it, we're going to want to save it. So to do that, the first thing we'll do is go back to the default workbench, go to our mod folder. We're going to create a new folder called Worlds. And inside of that folder, we're going to create a new folder called rs_scripting tutorial. And inside, once we've created that folder structure, we're going to head back to our world editor. We're going to click Save. We're going to drill down into that file or the folder that we created, and we're going to save our world as rs_scripting tutorial. In this particular case, the naming does not matter, just the way you structure the nesting, as it is good practice. Okay, with our world created, we're now going to insert the default prefabs and managers. I will list them on the screen here for your convenience, but you can also follow along with me. So the first one we're going to add is our default game mode, otherwise known as game mode plane. We're going to drop that in over here. What we're also going to do is open up the SCR automatic respawn handler and just ensure that the forced faction is 0. That will be the US faction. Then we're going to add ourselves a faction manager, specifically the faction manager _US cross USSR. Once we've added that, we'll just open the USSR faction and uncheck the is playable feature. We're then going to add ourselves a hit registration manager or hit reg manager. We're going to add ourselves an SCR_AI world prefab. This will allow the AI to operate within the world. With the SCR_AI world prefab, we're going to need to set a navmesh file under the navmesh world component. This is so that the AI will be able to correctly pathfind over the world. So we open this up, we go to Arma Reforger, Worlds, Game Master, Nav Meshes, and we want to select gm_eden.nmn. Following this, we will add ourselves a tag manager, then a campaign MP chat entity, a radio manager, a loadout manager across US and USSR. And then we're going to add a spawn point for both the US and USSR. Obviously, you may adjust these added prefabs to suit the need of your mission. I'm just showing you the best way to configure this setup such that you can test your AI spawning functionality. For the purpose of this tutorial, we will be using the game mode to manage our scripts, but best practice will be to extract the concerns of these scripts into separate files. I will cover this particular topic in a separate tutorial. So the last thing we will need to do for our setup is open the game mode entity and then navigate down here to the script submenu. We will add an on-game start to that script and it will open up the script manager for us. We're just going to minimize that for a second and then add a user script as well. If we go to edit, we'll see that our script is now open. Okay, this is where the magic starts happening. In the user script section, we're going to create our first protected method, a void called AI spawning. This method will take 4 parameters, so let's set up our protected void AI spawner. And this method takes 4 parameters. First one is a string called spawn group. This parameter is a prefab that we will use to determine which group to spawn. Second will be a vector called spawn position. This will determine the position for the group to spawn in. The third will be a string parameter called waypoint type. This parameter will be the prefab that we use to determine what waypoint to spawn for the group. And the last parameter will be a vector called waypoint position. And this parameter will be the vector position of the place that we'd like to spawn the waypoint in. Okay, so once we have the method, what we're going to quickly do is scaffold out the functionality of the method in comments, just so that we know what we're attempting to accomplish. So the first thing we want to do is generate a resource. The next thing we will want to do is generate the spawn parameters and spawn the group. And the third thing we're going to want to do is create a waypoint for this group. We'll then go ahead and create our second protected method. This will be a void called create waypoint. This method will take 3 parameters. The first one is scr_ai group, and this will be the group of the AI that we have just spawned in the above method. The second will be a string parameter called waypoint type that will be passed by the above method to this method, and the last a vector called waypoint position, again passed by the above method. We're going to do some more scaffolding quickly. So again, we will generate the resource. We'll then generate the spawn parameters once again and create the waypoint. Lastly, we're going to assign the waypoint to moving on, we're going to create our third protected method. It is a resource method, so protected resource, called generate and validate resource. So this method will take a single parameter, a string called resource to load. I would call it resource, but we're going to return a variable called resource here, and I'd rather not confuse the compiler. Once again, we'll just quickly scaffold out. So we're going to want to load the resource in this case. So then validate the prefab and show an appropriate error if invalid. Finally, we will return the resource such that it can be used by the caller method. And then the fourth and final protected method will be a protected entity spawn parameters method. Params, there we go. This method will be called generate spawn params. Pretty self-explanatory. And this method will take one parameter, a vector called position. And I promise there is a method to my madness. Often the most complex problems can be killed with good scaffolding. We will create a new set of spawn parameters. We'll then assign the position to those parameters. And lastly, we'll return this set of parameters. Brilliant. All our methods are nice and scaffolded out and created. Now, time for the meat of the problem. We're going to backtrack and start filling the methods up with the code that we created the comments for. So we'll head back up to the AI spawner. And the first thing we're going to do is load our resource. And this is pretty dead simple now because we've created a method for generating and validating these resources. So we'll say resource is equal to generate and validate resource, and we will pass it our spawn group in this instance. Then what we'll do is ensure that the returned resource is not null. In this case, if the returned resource is null, we want to print an error. So we'll say, let's just put that in extra brackets. AI spawner, that's the name of this method. Unable to load resource for the spawn group. We give it the string of the spawn group so that we can see what it is complaining about. Lastly, we'll give this a log level of error, just so that we know that this will get printed at an error level. Next, we're going to spawn the group itself. So we're going to create an str AI group. Group is equal to str AI group dot pass get game dot spawn entity prefab. And this thing is going to take our resource, null value, and then the spawn parameters method. So generate spawn parameters, and we can pass in our position. We need the spawn position vector. There we go. And then once again, to be safe, we will null check the group. If the group is in fact null, we want to print an error message. Unable to spawn group. Log level.error. Then the last thing we want to do is invoke our create waypoint method. And for that, we pass our group, our waypoint type, and our waypoint position. Perfect. And that is our spawner method. Moving on to the create waypoint method, we will once again invoke our generate and validate resource. So for this, we can actually just copy this across and supply waypoint type instead of the group. We will then want to once again null check this. In this case, we will take the create waypoint method as the tag for our error message, unable to load the resource for the waypoint. And we'll give it waypoint type. We will then create our AI waypoint. So AI waypoint is equal to AI waypoint dot cast get game dot spawn entity prefab the resource once again another null parameter, and then the generate spawn parameters method with our given waypoint position. That there will generate the waypoint for us. Once again, we will want to ensure that if something happens, while I'm thinking about it, we actually want these methods, if they error out, to return, such that they don't attempt to continue with null values. Okay, so if the waypoint in this case is null, we will print another error message. In this case, point able to create waypoints log level of error. The last thing we will do is assign the waypoint to the group with group.addWaypoint, supplying the waypoint as the parameter. Perfect. Okay, moving on to our generate and validate resource method. So, to ensure that the resource is loaded correctly, we will supply resource is equal to resource.load and the given string resource to load. We then want to ensure that that resource is in fact valid. So we'll open up an if statement and check if the resource is not valid. If the resource is not valid, we will print a lovely error message. It's a log level of error. This message will take this tag, resource is invalid. Resource as well, just so that we can see what is invalid, and then we will return null in this instance. If the resource is in fact valid, we will simply return the resource. Moving on to our last method. We're going to create ourselves a set of new spawn parameters. To do this, we will grab a new entity spawn rams. The rams is equal to entity spawn rams. Set the transform mode equal to e transform mode dot world. We will then assign the position of the third index of transform to our given position, and we will then return those parameters. And that concludes the custom methods for spawning AI. Now what we're going to do is shift over to the onGameStartOverride method, which we will use to invoke the spawning of the AI. So you know as well as I that the best thing to do in this particular instance is to scaffold. So what we need is string variables for our resources. We need entity variables for our positions. And we need to execute the AI spawning using a delayed call. As a side note, the reason we use a delayed call is because onGameStart is invoked in a single call manner. I'm trying to find a more succinct way to explain that, but effectively, it tries to execute everything in one go when onGameStart is executed. So as soon as onGameStarts, it will attempt to spawn this AI, but we actually want to delay that. And the reason we might want to delay that is for several reasons, but primarily we don't want to force the game to try and load everything for the AI before the game starts. You could run into performance issues if you try and do it that way. The other thing we need to do is just invoke super.onGameStart. And the reason we need to do that is just make sure that the default functionality still works for game mode playing. Okay, so string variables for our resources. We will need a spawn group. So string spawn group is equal to, and we'll just supply an empty string for now. String waypoint type is empty string. Then we will need the entity variables for our position. So let's say I entity spawned position is equal to get game get world dot find entity by name, which we will supply an empty name for in the meanwhile, as we haven't created those entities yet. And similarly, we will create a waypoint position entity. And then the last thing we will do is invoke the delayed caller. So get game, get call queue, if I can spell correctly, dot call later. And to this, we're going to supply the method we want to call, which in this case is the AI spawner. We'll give it a delay of 10 seconds, so 10 plus 3 zeros. We do not want to call this more than once, and then we need to supply all of our parameters. So spawn group, spawn position dot get origin, waypoint type, and waypoint position dot get origin. So waypoint position dot get origin and spawn position dot get origin, we've loaded them as entities here. But get origin just returns the vector location for those positions such that they match the supplied parameters for this AI spawner method. Okay, so the thing we will need to do quickly is go and collect some resources for our spawn group and waypoint type, and then create some entities for our spawn position and waypoint position. So first things first, let's open this up. We're going to go to our resource browser and we're going to look for a US group. In this particular case, we're going to find ourselves a rifle squad. We're going to right click on that and go copy resource names. Moving back to our script, we're just going to plug that resource name into our spawn group. We're then going to head back to our world editor, particularly our resource browser, and we're going to look for a move waypoint. So AI waypoint. AI waypoint. Just make sure you click back on the top of the tree, otherwise it will not be able to find anything. We're going to copy the resource name for this AI waypoint move. We will head back to our scripts under the workbench and plug this in over here. And then what we need to do quickly is create some entities to mark the locations for those two spawns. So I'm going to use a comment entity as they don't show up on the map and they don't have any visible markings. So let's just go plug one into the trees over here. So comment, comment, and we're going to name this guy USAI spawn point 1. Let's go 1. And then we're going to go ahead and copy this comment, head over to our nearby town. This will work by the fireplace. We're going to paste that comment in and we're going to call this USAI waypoint move underscore 1. And we're just quickly going to save that. Okay, and then all we need to do is copy those names across. So let's head back to our script editor. First one we're going to copy across is the USAI spawn point 1. Second one we're going to copy across is the USAI waypoint move 1. Now, obviously the names aren't hugely important, but it does make it easier for us to find them if they're named appropriately. Okay, that's it. We finished all the scripting required for spawning our AI and for giving them waypoints. As you can see, there's not a lot of code here, only about 95 lines in total. So all that's left is to load it up and go test it. This is a good point in validating the script, so if we just open this up and say validate scripts, it'll point us to any errors it may have found. Undefined function. Have I spelt get call Q wrong? Yes, I gave it a capital Q. That explains that. Let's give it a validate. Perfect. Scripts are validated. We can give this a launch. Well, there you have it. I hope I've covered everything with appropriate depth. If you'd like to follow along without having to type out the code while we're busy, in the description you'll find a link to a Git repo with the source code for this tutorial. As before, if you have any further questions, comments, or requests for more tutorials, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy mission making.